Thank you so much for joining us as we embark on this educational journey of knowledge. My name is Isaac.
And I'm Brooke.
Today we'll be introducing you to an iconic changemaker who made an everlasting impact in history. This person is...
Marsha P. Johnson.
We will be covering what they did and their motivations, how they lived their life, the actions that had the greatest impact on our world, and the legacy they left behind.
Marsha P. Johnson was a Black transgender woman, self-identified drag queen, and an activist who was outspoken as they fought for the rights of trans people of color, and who made an everlasting impact on the LGBTQIA+ community.
Which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, and in addition to other sexual orientations besides straight.
To clarify, we will be using queer as an umbrella term to describe anyone within the LGBTQ community who does not define themselves as straight. Along with that, while we recognize that gender goes beyond the two norms of both male and female, Marsha P. Johnson was someone who was assigned male at birth, but who identified as female throughout her life. So that is how we will be referring to her today.
Marsha was one of the key figures who stood up to the police during the 1969 Stonewall riots/rebellion. Stonewall was a place of fun and safety for the LGBTQ+ community, and because of the police raids, this led to many nights of violence and terror against the community. Marsha led many protests that started the movement for equality, but Marsha also faced multiple arrests, but nevertheless, it did not stop them from fighting for what was right. They were the voice for so many in the gay and trans community, but also the voice for so many people of color in those communities who had no voice. The bravery and courage of her and countless others started the LGBT rights movement.
Going back a little bit in Marsha's life, she was born on August 25th of 1945 in Elizabeth, New Jersey. From an early age, Marsha began experimenting with the clothes that she wore and how she expressed herself for gender. After growing up and completing high school, Marsha moved to Greenwich Village in New York. It was here where Marsha discovered a little bit more of who she was and found connections within the growing LGBT community that was starting there. Marsha found a love for performing in drag. And drag is when someone creates another character or persona for themselves that they dress up as and identify with as a way of expressing themselves. Isaac, speaking of which, can you guess what the P in Marsha's name stood for?
Precious?
Very close. But actually, when people would ask Marsha about her gender and if she was a boy or a girl, which were questions she didn't like very much, her response would be, "Pay it no mind." And so she eventually just incorporated that into her drag name. As she became more well-known within the community, she took on the role of a drag mother and committed herself to taking care of the young and homeless LGBTQ youth that she was starting to see in her community. Following the Stonewall riots, Marsha continued her efforts towards advocating and protecting the LGBTQ community. Alongside her friend Sylvia Rivera, who was a transgender Latinx activist and performer, the two founded a group that set out to provide shelter to the homeless members of the community across multiple states in the 1970s. Along with that, Marsha also became part of a group that sought for the liberation and protection of gay and queer people, regardless of their race, age, sex, or gender identity. This, in particular, is significant because it was one of the first groups to welcome itself to gay and queer people who were transgender. Before this, trans people were still not being accepted as much within their own queer community.
Countless organizations started up as a way of honoring Marsha's legacy, like the Marsha P. Johnson Institution, which says its mission is to protect and defend the human rights of Black transgender people. Because of Marsha and so many other people's courage, we start to see big changes happening in our world. For instance, Pride Parades, a way to celebrate love, community, and pride, originally started in New York, San Francisco, LA, and now in many other places around the world. We also see the removal of homosexuality from the DSM, which stands for Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which labeled homosexuality as a sexual orientation disturbance. Major changes had been made after many years of protest and lobbying. The DSM removed homosexuality in December of 1973. Supreme Court rulings also changed for the better when the U.S. legalized marriage equality in 2015.
When looking at the positive impacts that Marsha had on the LGBTQ community, it is just as important to recognize the motivations that inspired her efforts. Throughout her life, Marsha was motivated to fight against oppression and injustice towards the LGBTQ community because she was a part of it. Being a drag queen, a transgender woman, and especially a transgender woman of color, Marsha experienced intense judgment and harassment because of her gender and how she chose to express herself throughout her life. Particularly, the role Marsha played during the Stonewall riots was hugely motivated by her being fed up with the mistreatment of the queer community that she and others had been facing, and demanding that things changed. Overall, Marsha's activism was rooted and motivated by the struggles that she faced as a transgender and queer person, and her hope that things would get better for the queer community in the future.
Looking back at Marsha's legacy, Marsha continues to be a model for so many trans women of color today as we continue to fight for equal justice. In our nation, we still see an overwhelming amount of harassment towards our LGBTQ+ community, but more specifically towards our transgender women of color. Marsha's legacy continues to live on as the LGBTQ+ community becomes more accepted around the world and during the celebration of Pride.
The perspective on the LGBTQ community has also shifted from something that was once shamed to now being more accepted and even appreciated for its visibility and individuality. Marsha's activism in life was dedicated to protecting those within the LGBTQ community, and her unfortunate death at the age of 47 remains a reminder that the fight for equal rights and protection is not over, and that we as a nation have a lot of work to do in order to protect our trans brothers and sisters of color.
I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us on this podcast segment. But before we leave you, we kind of just wanted to talk a little bit more about why we picked Marsha and why we chose to talk about her. I know for me, being a part of the LGBTQ+ community, it was very important to talk about someone who represents me and represents my community. I think when I talk about her courage and who she was as a person, I really do mean it, because we got to see that from the get-go. Like, right off the bat during the Stonewall riots, like, she was that voice for people in our community, but also people of color in our community, and that was not very representative. And we didn't see that until we saw her marching and fighting for what we wanted and the equal rights that we deserve. And I think that's just very powerful.
It is very powerful, I agree. And I think something that Marsha really means to me is just being okay with being the one who has to stand and fight. I think Marsha is a really great example of someone who was a part of the LGBT community and who was not going to accept the injustice anymore, and it was something that these people, and even nowadays in our community, there's still a lot of injustice and harassment that goes on, but Marsha, she really took on that role to be someone who fought for everybody and who was that voice, even though it put her under fire in a lot of ways and made her a target.
Brooke, what do you think Marsha would say about what's happening today? Like, how far we've come as a community, or how far we've come as a society, more specifically within the U.S.?
That's a really great question, Isaac. I think in some ways Marsha would be really, really proud of some of the progress we've made in terms of marriage equality and having the LGBTQ community being more accepted within the popular culture and within the more mainstream culture. But I think she would also be really disheartened by some of the backward steps we've taken in terms of protecting the people within those communities. I think that while there's still a lot of room to celebrate the growth, we need to really keep in mind that Marsha was an activist at heart, and she was always concerned with what other people needed and how to support those around her. And I think that in our nation, we still have a lot of work to do in that way. And that's the energy we need to keep moving forward. We need to do what Marsha would do and support the homeless people in our communities. We need to reach out and fight together to demand better treatment overall in every area.
No, yeah, honestly, and I think like because we're in 2020, and this whole situation that we're living in, the pandemic, it's really brought to the forefront of what's most important, and it's health and community and love, and that's something we've been lacking a lot in the past 4 years, honestly, in my opinion. Specifically with the trans community, we need to see better healthcare, and we need to see equality in the medical field, because like there's not a lot of that. And like you said, like we're taking backward steps, which makes no sense whatsoever. And I think we just need to better understand what's needed when it comes to like basic human health. And I think that's something she would be very passionate about and be on the forefront of that conversation.
Absolutely. Something else I really wanted to bring attention to, and one of the reasons I wanted to focus on Marsha P. Johnson for this podcast, was in a lot of ways the LGBTQ community, as it's become more widely accepted within society, there's a perspective on it that is often looked at from a cisgender, which is often the gender that you are assigned at birth, and from a very white perspective. And a lot of times the representation is not there when looking at the community, and the efforts made by the people of color within the community are often disregarded and not given the recognition that they deserve. And I really wanted to take this assignment and focus it on learning about somebody who made a huge and growing impact, honestly, and who was still not really given the credit for their contributions. There was a movie focusing on Stonewall a few years ago, and there was no mention of Marsha P. Johnson, and it was a very whitewashed representation of that story. And so I wanted to figure out who she was and kind of give her that recognition that she deserves for the work that she's done for everybody, and especially for us in the community.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, like, to talk about that movie, I have not seen it, but, like, it's good we have that representation, and that's awesome. But I think what really also matters would be that it's accurate and that it's actually representing the majority of what was going on during that time, which was, injustice for the LGBTQ plus community, but also that who was the leader, who was talking about that, who was making it known, and that was Marsha, and we saw not a lot of her in that. But I think for me, the reason why I wanted to be talking about Marsha as well was, I didn't really know about her until maybe a year or two ago, and it wasn't until I came to college and I started doing my own research that I started to figure out who these people were. And Marsha was one of those who was brought to my attention, and I was like, why didn't I learn about her, in school, or, talking about pride when I was younger? And that was never a part of the conversation, and I had to do that research on my own. And I think it's our responsibility to do that research, but I think sharing stories and sharing the legacy that others left behind is just as important.
Absolutely. And as educators, that's what we are set out to do, is to work on educating ourselves about the history and about what really happened in a lot of situations, and also sharing that information with other people, which is why we set out to do this podcast, to inform others about the really incredible work that Marsha P. Johnson has done and about the lasting implications of that work.
Yeah, true. Alrighty, folks. Once again, we just wanted to thank you so much for listening to our podcast. Just wanted to share that we love you, we appreciate you, and no matter what, just continue being who you are and continue to share love and positivity in the world, and I think we really need that.
Especially now, we really do. And remember, if anyone ever tries to make you feel bad for being who you are, be just like Marsha P. Johnson and pay them no mind. Thank you for listening.
Pay them no mind. Alright, signing out, Isaac and
Brooke.